You lie back and imagine yourself drifting southward along the Nile, where the river narrows, the desert presses in close, and the air grows hot and dry. This is ancient Nubia, a region of rock and sand and riverine life, known to Egypt as Tasseti, the land of the bow, and later as Kush. It was here, in settlements pressed between cliffs and riverbanks, that men and women lived ordinary lives shaped by the slow rhythm of the Nile floods, the shifting winds, and the pressing need for survival. And here, too, people developed the quiet art of cloth, not only weaving it, but coloring it, coaxing brilliance from roots, stones, insects, and plants that might seem, at first glance, dull. The dyes of Nubia were no small matter. Cloth was currency, identity, and necessity. A tunic dyed in rare shades spoke of wealth and power. A scrap of plain undyed linen served for work and toil. Nubians were not alone in valuing color, but their location at the crossroads of Africa meant that they had access to both local materials and trade goods that carried stories from far away. The work of dyeing cloth was not a glamorous task. It involved hours of gathering, grinding, soaking, and waiting. But in its patient repetition, it shaped daily life and anchored Nubia in the networks of ancient exchange. The landscape of color. The first step in Nubian dyeing began with the land itself. Along the banks of the Nile, reeds and papyrus dominated, but patches of cultivated land supported flax, sorghum, and other crops. The flax, spun into linen, was the common base cloth. Linen was difficult to dye compared to wool, its fibers smooth and resistant to absorbing pigments, but Nubians found ways, coaxing color to bind through mordants and repeated soaking. The desert beyond offered stones rich in minerals. Iron oxides yielded shades of red and brown, while copper compounds hinted at greens and blues. Insects too played their part. Crushed cochineal-like beetles, though better known later in the Americas, had African cousins that provided shades of crimson when painstakingly gathered. The madder plant, with roots dug deep into the soil, yielded red dyes that clung stubbornly to cloth, a color cherished across the ancient world. To gather these resources required labor, children picking plants under the sun, women grinding roots into powders, men hauling baskets of stone from dry wadis. Each act was unremarkable, repeated day after day, yet together they built a palette from which Nubians painted their textiles. The work of the dye house. Picture a Nubian settlement, mud brick houses clustered near the river, a courtyard where vessels of clay stand blackened from fire, and a half-dug pit filled with water tinged green. Here, in dye houses that were less buildings than open yards, artisans worked. They were not celebrated like kings or generals, but they were indispensable. The process was tedious. Cloth, often linen, had to be washed first, scoured of oils, and beaten against stones to loosen its fibers. Then came mordant substances that fixed the dye to the cloth. Alum, a mineral imported through trade, was highly prized. Ashes from burned wood or even urine were used locally as substitutes, their chemical properties binding pigment to fiber. Once prepared, the cloth would be immersed in vats of dye. These were not the neat steel tubs of modern imagination, but clay pots, half buried for stability, filled with boiling plant matter or ground minerals. Fires had to be stoked constantly to maintain heat. The work was slow. A cloth dipped once might yield a pale shade, dipped again and again it deepened, becoming richer, stronger. Each piece had to be lifted, wrung, dried, and inspected. The smell of a dye house was pungent of boiling roots, acrid urine, smoky fires. It was not a place of beauty, though the results would be admired in markets and courts. It was work, and boring work at that, with endless waiting, endless stirring, endless washing. Yet this work carried within it the possibility of transformation. The plain became colored, the ordinary became precious. Trade and value. Nubia was never an isolated land. Its position along the Nile made it a conduit between Central Africa and Egypt, and through Egypt, the Mediterranean. Caravans stretched south and west, bringing ivory, gold, ebony, and incense. Among these goods, dyed cloth moved as well, both as finished garments and as raw materials for further trade. Brightly dyed fabrics were more than ornament. They were indicators of identity, distinguishing Nubian elites from commoners and Nubian goods from Egyptian ones. Egyptian records occasionally describe tribute from Kush, including dyed textiles, valued alongside gold and exotic animals. Nubians too desired imported cloth, particularly woolens, which held dye more readily than linen. Wool, rare in Nubia's climate, had to be brought in, and when dyed with indigo or madder, it became a luxury item. The exchange of dyed cloth reveals a quiet truth of history. Wealth was not only in gold, but in the ability to make the ordinary extraordinary. A piece of fabric, dyed painstakingly in deep red or luminous yellow, could equal the value of livestock or land. This gave the dye workers, however lowly, a hand in shaping economies. Ritual and symbol. Color carried symbolic weight. Red might evoke blood and vitality, or, in some contexts, danger and chaos. White, the color of undyed linen, was purity and ritual. Yellow, extracted from safflower or pomegranate rind, suggested the sun. Black, achieved through soot or certain mineral mixes, could signify rebirth. In burials, dyed cloth wrapped the dead. In rituals, priests donned specific colors. While Egyptian influence was heavy, their symbolism often dominant in Nubian culture, Nubia retained its own meanings, some now lost to us. Archaeologists uncover scraps of colored fabric in tombs, faded by centuries, but still carrying traces of the choices made by long-dead hands. Imagine the slow wrapping of a body in linen, the placing of amulets, the care taken to ensure that colors aligned with the journey into the afterlife. Such acts were not rushed. They were precise, ordinary, repeated hundreds of times across generations. And each time, dyed cloth bore witness to human attempts to transcend mortality. Daily life in cloth. Beyond ritual and trade, dyed cloth was part of daily existence. A farmer's tunic might be a pale yellow from cheap plant dyes. A child's wrap could carry faint streaks of red, unevenly fixed. The elite wore garments of deeper hues, perhaps combined with embroidery. Cloth wore out quickly. Sand, sweat, and sun degraded fibers, and new cloth had to be woven and dyed again. This constant cycle meant work for weavers and dyers never ceased. For the Nubian household, cloth was both necessity and burden. Mothers spun flax threads endlessly, daughters wove, sons carried reeds for looms. The dye house was only the final step in a chain of monotonous labor. Yet in the midst of the monotony, there was resilience. To clothe oneself was to persist, to maintain dignity in a harsh land. And through dyeing, Nubians not only clothed themselves but proclaimed their place in the larger story of the Nile Valley. The unresolved question. As we drift further into this history, one wonders, how much of Nubia's identity was woven, dyed, and worn? Did the colors of cloth shape how Nubians saw themselves, or were they merely practical, traded away for goods more vital? And what does it mean that so much of this work, laborious, repetitive, ordinary, is forgotten, while only the faint scraps of fabric survive in the desert sands? The Nile does not stop at Nubia, and neither did the story of its cloth. You might picture barges drifting northward, loaded with cargo under the glare of the sun. Amphorae filled with oil, baskets brimming with grain, and bundles of cloth, folded, stacked, dyed, and ready for trade, crept slowly towards Egypt. In return, Nubians received copper tools, imported woods, beads of faience, and at times, woolen textiles dyed with methods different from their own. The relationship between Nubia and its neighbors was defined not only by conquest or tribute, but by the quiet flow of such goods. Cloth, especially when brightened with persistent dyes, was a form of silent language. It announced wealth without words. It recorded cultural boundaries not in inscriptions but in hues. And as you lean into this story, you may begin to see how Nubia, though often remembered in history only when armies marched through its deserts, was deeply entangled with the wider world through the most ordinary of things, the dyed thread. The Egyptian shadow. Egypt looms in nearly every tale of Nubia. For millennia, the powerful kingdoms to the north cast their eyes southward, seeking gold, cattle, and people. Yet in matters of cloth, the relationship was more complex than domination alone. Egyptians were masters of linen weaving, their white garments shining in temple reliefs and tomb paintings. But linen resisted deep dyeing, often yielding only pale or muted tones. Nubians, by necessity and experiment, developed methods that gave color more grip. Egyptian texts describe tribute from Kush that included colored cloths, listed alongside gold and incense. These records are dull inventories, numbers of items rather than stories of lives, yet they reveal value. Why include cloth among the treasures of empire if it were not precious? For the Egyptians, Nubian textiles offered something different, perhaps brighter, perhaps deeper, than what their own workshops produced. Still, influence flowed both ways. Egyptian motifs and weaving styles appeared in Nubian garments, especially among elites. Inscriptions and art suggest that Nubian rulers, when adopting Egyptian rituals, wore garments of linen, sometimes left white, sometimes dyed. The two traditions intertwined, threads crossing and recrossing the cultural boundaries of the Nile. The question of indigo. Among the dyes most coveted in the ancient world was indigo, a deep, lasting blue extracted from plants of the Indigofera family. Whether Nubia produced indigo locally or obtained it through trade remains debated among scholars. Evidence of indigo-dyed textiles has been found in Egyptian burials from the 2nd millennium BCE, and some of these may have originated from further south. Indigo required complex preparation. Leaves fermented in vats, the liquid aerated to coax the blue dye to precipitate. This was no simple process. It demanded patience, control of temperature, and careful timing. If Nubians practiced it, their dye houses must have buzzed with activity, stirring, waiting, lifting cloth into the sun, and watching it shift from green to blue as the air transformed the dye. If instead they imported it, the blue threads testify to Nubia's place in a broader commercial network, linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and beyond. Either way, indigo in Nubia tells us something essential. Color was worth effort. A plain tunic kept one clothed. A blue tunic proclaimed one's place in the world. Gold and cloth, twin currencies. Gold mines dotted Nubia's deserts. Egyptian kings long sought them, and Nubian kings after them. Gold glittered, but cloth endured. Together, they served as twin currencies of Nubian power. Archaeological finds suggest that Nubian rulers used textiles not only in trade but as gifts, rewards, and symbols of loyalty. In the royal courts of Kerma and later Napata, brightly dyed cloth likely adorned courtiers and guards, distinguishing them in rank and role. Gold showed wealth, but cloth showed reach, the ability to harness labor, manage resources, and access trade. In this way, Nubia's economy rested not only on extraction of precious metal, but on the production of dyed fibers, woven day after day in homes and workshops. It is a reminder that history is not only about crowns and armies. It is also about hands at looms, fingers twisting threads, children fetching water, and workers tending vats of dye. Without them, there would be no garments to proclaim status, no cloth to trade, no fabric to wrap the dead. Daily toil, imperial web. For the ordinary Nubian, weaving and dyeing were not exotic trades. They were routine, learned from parents and neighbors, repeated without question. Loom weights and spindle whorls appear in excavations of modest houses, showing that textile work happened in nearly every household. Dyeing, while more specialized, still relied on community effort, gathering roots, preparing mordants, stoking fires. This toil, boring and endless, linked Nubia to empires. A woman grinding madder root may not have thought of Egypt, but the red cloth she helped produce could eventually appear in a noble's household hundreds of miles away. A boy hauling water for a dye pit may not have imagined trade caravans, but the cloth soaking in that vat might travel with one. Ordinary actions bound Nubia into extraordinary networks, and without them, history's grand narratives would falter. Yet the people themselves remain faceless. Their names are lost, their labor unrecorded. Only the fragments of cloth endure, silent witnesses to the vast web of exchange spun across the ancient world. Faded remnants. Archaeologists recover these threads by chance. The desert preserves what damp climates consume. Tombs yield scraps of linen, sometimes still faintly colored, reds dulled to brown, blues faded to gray, yellows almost indistinguishable from the fabric itself. Each scrap is studied under microscopes, dyes extracted and analyzed chemically. In labs far from Nubia, scholars reconstruct recipes once passed down by word of mouth. The results are often humdrum, confirmation that matter was used, that iron-rich mud gave black, that indigo may have been present. Yet behind these data lie stories of patience, of trial and error, of communities finding ways to transform their environment into lasting marks of culture. The fragments remind us that history often survives in its most boring details. The residue of plant dye on a fiber, the mineral trace in a thread. They are clues, nothing more, but together they allow us to glimpse a world where color mattered deeply. The unresolved question. As we follow these threads, a question emerges. Did Nubian cloth simply serve others, Egyptian kings, foreign traders, or did it form the fabric of Nubian self-expression as well? Were the colors wrapped around Nubian rulers in Napata or Mera statements of independence or echoes of Egyptian taste? And if cloth could carry identity, how much of Nubia's voice survives in the colors that have now faded to dust? The Nubian sun does not soften. It beats down endlessly, bleaching stone and sand. Yet against this stark backdrop, people continue to weave, to dye, and to wrap themselves in color. By the first millennium BCE, the kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata and later at Mera, had grown into a formidable power, inheriting and reshaping traditions from both Nubia's own past and Egypt's long shadow. Cloth brightly dyed, carefully woven, remained at the heart of its identity. In the quiet persistence of textile work, Nubia found both continuity and transformation. This is the final chapter in our story of Nubian dyes. How they reached their height in Mera, how they faded with time, and how their legacy endures not in intact garments, but in threads, tombs, and the patience of modern archaeology. Mera, a city of iron and cloth. Mera, the later capital of Kush, is often remembered as a city of iron. Its furnaces belched smoke, its slag heaps grew high, and its smiths supplied tools and weapons that fed both agriculture and armies. But Mera was also a city of cloth. Excavations have revealed spindle whorls, loom weights, and dye traces scattered across domestic sites. Here, the production of textiles was no longer a small household affair alone. It was organized, sustained, and likely taxed, a craft woven into the state's economy. Meroitic rulers styled themselves as heirs of both Nubian and Egyptian traditions. They built pyramids for their burials, though smaller and steeper than those in Giza. They wrote in their own script, still only partly deciphered, and they clothed themselves in garments that blended Egyptian linen forms with Nubian vibrancy. Cloth was a marker of their hybrid identity, as much as architecture or writing. The dye houses of Mera must have been busy, feeding both local demand and the steady pull of trade. Red from madder, yellow from safflower or pomegranate, indigo blues. These were not luxuries but essentials for expressing power, hierarchy, and culture. Cloth in tombs. Kushite pyramids at Mera and Napata, though plundered, have yielded scraps of cloth. Some were wrappings for the dead, others fragments of garments. When scientists examine them, they find not only the dyes themselves but the patterns of weave, the tightness of threads, the marks of wear. Each scrap tells of a garment worn in life, then repurposed in death, linking the living and the departed in fiber and color. The colors in these tombs, though faded, carried meaning. Red perhaps to recall vitality, white for purity, black for regeneration. These choices were not casual. They were deliberate, part of rituals meant to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. That people expended time, labor, and resources on such cloth shows the centrality of dyed textiles not only in life, but in the cosmology of death. And yet these colors did not survive intact. The desert preserved them only partially. Where once there were vibrant hues, now there are browns and yellows, faint traces that whisper rather than speak. The meaning is blurred, the expression muted. What survives is enough to remind us of what is lost. The decline of a craft. As centuries passed, the kingdom of Kush weakened. Trade routes shifted, Roman power expanded, and the rise of Axum in Ethiopia drew commerce elsewhere. By the 4th century CE, Meroe itself had fallen, its pyramids left as silent markers in the desert. What became of its dye houses? Likely they slowed, then stopped, as demand dwindled and political structures fractured. The craft may have continued in villages, in households, but without state support and expansive trade, it could no longer anchor Nubia's identity as it once had. Over time, other cultures, other fabrics, and other dyes replaced the Nubian legacy. History is not kind to crafts that leave little durable trace. Stone endures, metal survives, but cloth vanishes. With it vanishes the memory of the countless people who spun flax, gathered roots, stirred vats, and carried water. Only archaeology allows us glimpses, enough to reconstruct the dull but essential truth. Nubia's dyes mattered. The modern recovery. In the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists and historians have returned to Nubia's sands, spurred in part by the flooding caused by the Aswan High Dam, which submerged vast areas of ancient Nubia under Lake Nasser. In the rescue excavations, textiles emerged, scraps too fragile to last long once exposed, yet invaluable. Modern laboratories analyze these remnants. Chromatography, spectroscopy, chemical testing, all reveal the dyes used, the methods implied, the trade routes hinted at. What was once mere color on fabric becomes data mapped and compared. And so the most ordinary of things, a faded scrap of cloth, becomes a historical witness, bridging millennia. But these recoveries also remind us of absence. For every fragment found, thousands have perished. For every dyed thread that speaks, countless others have gone silent. What we reconstruct is partial, incomplete, a shadow of the textile world Nubians knew. The broader legacy. What then is the legacy of Nubia's dyes? It is not found in continuous tradition. Modern Nubian textiles no longer follow the same recipes. Nor is it found in monuments, for dye houses leave little trace. Instead, the legacy is in the recognition that color itself was central to Nubian survival and identity. Cloth connected Nubia to Egypt, to the Mediterranean, and to Africa's interior. It served as wealth, tribute, and ritual. It embodied the patience of countless unnamed workers and the ambitions of rulers. It faded, as all cloth does, yet in its fading it still marked Nubia's place in history. Perhaps its greatest legacy is a lesson in perspective. We often imagine that history is shaped only by kings, battles, or temples. Yet here, in the quiet repetition of dyeing cloth, in the boiling of vats and the wringing of linen, a civilization defined itself. Boring work, yes, but work that mattered. Reflection. As you drift toward sleep, you might reflect on this, that the most fragile of things, threads, colors, fabric, can outlast stone in memory if not in substance. That the people who dyed cloth in Nubia, unrecorded and forgotten, still touch us through the faint hues left behind. And that history in all its grandeur rests on such ordinary labor. And so we end the story of Nubia's dyes, but the question lingers. If our own lives are woven of ordinary acts, what fragments will remain when centuries pass? Will the traces of our daily work carry meaning to others, as faint and as vital as a thread of faded red from the sands of Nubia? You close your eyes and picture a flat plain stretching toward the horizon. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates cut through the land, winding like silver threads, flooding seasonally and leaving behind rich silt. This was Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where the first cities grew, where ziggurats rose, and where writing itself was born. But writing did not begin with poetry or royal decrees. It began with numbers scratched onto clay. It began with tallies of sheep, jars of oil, baskets of barley. Before epic tales or prayers to the gods, there were ledgers, and the hands that made them belonged not to poets but to bureaucrats. This is the story of those ledger stones, small, unremarkable, heavy in the hand. They are boring to look at, grids of symbols, repeating signs, endless lists. And yet, within their monotony lies the foundation of civilization. For in recording the ordinary, the ancient Mesopotamians built a system of accountability, memory, and order that made their great cities possible. Counting before writing. Long before the first cuneiform tablets, Mesopotamians used clay tokens. These were small, shaped pieces, cones, spheres, discs, each representing a unit of something: a sheep, a jar of oil, a measure of grain. To keep track of many items, the tokens were placed in sealed clay envelopes called bulli. The envelope could be broken to verify the count inside. This was clever, but also cumbersome. A merchant carrying dozens of tokens might find them slipping through his fingers, and the envelopes could not hold infinite numbers. Eventually, people pressed the tokens into the clay surface of the envelopes, making impressions that represented the items without needing to store the tokens themselves. From here, it was a short step to pressing marks directly onto flat tablets. Thus, writing was born not from a desire to tell stories, but from the dull necessity of bookkeeping. Civilization's first script was the accountant's tool. The shape of the ledger. Imagine an ancient official sitting at a wooden table in a mud-brick room, a lump of clay before him. He smooths it flat, takes a reed stylus, and begins to press signs. The marks are small, wedge-shaped strokes, cuneiform. He is not composing anything beautiful. He is recording, line after line, that a temple received 5 sheep, that 3 jars of beer were distributed, that 20 workers were allotted grain rations. These tablets are monotonous. Modern archaeologists have recovered thousands. Many read almost identically, varying only in the numbers or the goods listed. They seem boring, and they are boring, but they are also extraordinary. They reveal the structure of ancient economies, temples as centers of distribution, laborers sustained by rations, herds and harvests managed through meticulous tracking. Without these records, the system could not function. People forget. Memory fades. Oral tallies are disputed. But clay endures. A tablet once dried or baked became as permanent as stone. The sheep could be slaughtered, the barley eaten, but the record remained, holding people accountable across time. The bureaucrat's world. To live as a scribe or bureaucrat in early Mesopotamia was to live in repetition. One tablet looked much like another. The work was endless, recording inflows of goods, outflows to laborers, tribute received, taxes owed. These were not the grand tasks of kingship, but the grind of administration. Scribes were trained from youth. They copied the same signs repeatedly on practice tablets, memorizing number systems and commodity symbols. Errors were scolded, mistakes punished. In time, they graduated to real work, not poetry but ledgers. Their world was measured in sheep and jars. If they thought of the future, it was not eternity or immortality but the next delivery, the next calculation. They rarely saw the goods themselves. A line of men might deliver baskets of grain, but the scribe sat apart, stylus in hand, reducing reality to signs on clay. His work was detached, impersonal, yet vital. Civilization relied on his boredom. Temples and redistribution. Most early ledgers came from temples. These were not only religious centers but economic hubs. Land belonged to the gods, worked by tenants and laborers. Produce was collected in temple storehouses, redistributed as rations, offerings, or trade. To manage this required record-keeping. Every delivery of grain, every herd animal, every jar of oil had to be tracked. Workers were fed according to their labor, men, women, children, each with specified allotments. The ledgers reveal this in detail. They show us daily life not through stories but through numbers. How much barley an ordinary man received, how little a child was allotted, how rations varied by status. It was not fair, it was not equal, but it was organized, and the organization gave Mesopotamian cities their strength. The ordinary made monumental. The irony of history is that these ledgers, boring records of goods, have outlasted nearly everything else. Palaces crumbled, wooden furniture rotted, cloth decayed, but clay tablets endured. When cities burned, tablets baked harder. When walls collapsed, tablets were buried, preserved in the soil. Today, museums hold shelves of them. Visitors glance and move on, unimpressed by the repetition of wedges. Yet for archaeologists, they are treasure, not gold but knowledge. Through them, we know how many sheep grazed the fields, how grain flowed into temples, how beer was brewed and distributed. Civilization rests on such details. Without ledgers, cities could not feed their people, armies could not be supplied, kings could not project power. The grand monuments of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, the statues, the temples, were possible only because somewhere, someone boredly scratched numbers into clay. The unresolved question. And so we pause, with thousands of clay tablets spread before us. Their wedge-shaped marks still legible after 5,000 years. They whisper of sheep counted, barley weighed, rations allotted. But the question remains, did the scribes themselves see their work as meaningful or only as tedium? Did they understand they were inventing writing, or were they simply making another tally, unaware that the scratch of reed on clay was changing human history? The world of early Mesopotamia was not made of marble or bronze. It was made of mud, mud for bricks, mud for vessels, mud for tablets. And out of mud came the invention that reshaped humanity, writing. But at first, writing was no more than the silent hum of bureaucracy, a way to count. In the dull strokes of a reed stylus pressed into wet clay lay the future of law, literature, and empire. To understand how the boring lists of sheep and barley became words and stories, we must follow the gradual, almost accidental evolution of record-keeping. It was not driven by visionaries seeking to tell epics, but by administrators facing the endless problem of keeping track of things. From tallies to tablets, tokens, bully, tablets, this was the sequence. The first marks were not abstract. A cone stood for a measure of grain, a sphere for a sheep. When tokens were pressed into clay envelopes, the marks became symbols. When scribes began to draw the symbol without the token, writing had begun. At first, it was still strictly numerical, lists of items with quantities. A clay tablet might show rows of wedge impressions, each representing measures of barley. Then came pictographs, simple drawings scratched into the surface. A fish drawn beside a number meant so many fish. Over time, the pictographs became stylized, reduced to wedge marks made by pressing the stylus at different angles. The abstract script we know as cuneiform was born. And yet for centuries, the content remained monotonous. Still sheep, still jars of oil, still beer rations. The leap from numbers to language was slow, gradual, and accidental. The scribal schools. As cities grew, so too did the need for scribes. Training was rigorous and it began early. Young boys, mostly from families of some means, were sent to tablet houses, the Adaba or House of Tablets. Here they practiced day after day, copying lists, memorizing signs. A scribe's first lessons were not poems but accounting exercises. He copied the same signs over and over. The wedge for 1, the wedge for 10, the sign for sheep, the sign for barley. The exercises were dull, repetitive, designed to instill muscle memory as much as understanding. Mistakes were punished. Discipline was harsh. Yet through this boring training, scribes gained power. Few people could read or write. To hold the stylus was to hold authority, to mediate between rulers, temples, and the goods that sustained them. A king might wield a scepter, but a scribe's stylus could define how much grain was his to command. The expansion of records. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Tablets recorded more than goods. They listed names, workers receiving rations, officials overseeing herds. They recorded transactions, loans, sales, transfers of land. The ledger had grown more complex, reflecting a society that demanded accountability in every sphere. Still, the style was dry. A land sale might read, 1 field of barley, 3 measures by 4 belonging to so-and-so, transferred to so-and-so, witnessed by these men. No drama, no flourish, only formula. But formula was precisely what made it effective. The repetition of legal phrases created precedent, stability, and trust. Slowly, a script devised for sheep counting became a script of law, and from law, it could expand to everything else. The silent power of the scribe. The power of the scribes lay not only in their skill but in their obscurity. To most people, the marks on clay were meaningless scratches. Only scribes could interpret them, and this monopoly gave them influence. They could ensure accuracy or twist numbers subtly. A scribe could understate a tax, exaggerate a delivery, or shift a debt. Most did their work faithfully, but the potential for corruption was always present. Trust in scribes was essential. They were the custodians of truth in a world where truth was written, not spoken. Their power was quiet, bureaucratic, and dull, but real. To be a scribe was to live in the margins of society. Not a king, not a laborer, but a necessary cog. Without them, temples could not collect offerings, armies could not be fed, and cities could not stand. Theirs was the hidden strength of order. Boring brilliance. The brilliance of this system lay in its banality. A society that spends the effort to track sheep and barley, to record every jar of oil, builds resilience. Surpluses can be stored, debts enforced, workers fed. In times of famine, records show what is owed. In times of war, records show what can be mustered. The ledgers of Mesopotamia created accountability across generations. A man could die, but his debt remained recorded. A field could change hands, but its dimensions endured in clay. Time itself was managed through these records. What was ephemeral became fixed. It is easy to dismiss the tablets as tedious. Thousands of near-identical lists, numbers, and names. Yet in them, civilization hardened. Without them, there could be no Hammurabi's laws, no royal decrees, no Epic of Gilgamesh. All those depended first on the tedious, repetitive work of record-keeping. The unresolved question. And so we leave this section with another pause. If writing emerged from boredom, from the dull task of counting sheep in jars, what does that say about the nature of human progress? Do the greatest achievements of culture rest not on inspiration, but on administration? Did the Mesopotamian scribes, pressing their stylus into clay, realize that in their monotonous labor they were laying the groundwork for poetry and philosophy? Or did they see only the endless list stretching before them, another day's work in the heat of the plain? Civilizations rise on the strength of armies, on the fertility of fields, and on the authority of kings. Yet beneath all of these lies a quieter foundation, the bureaucracy that keeps accounts. Mesopotamia was the first to carve this foundation in clay. Its ledgers, thousands upon thousands of tablets filled with wedges and numbers, created a permanence that outlasted dynasties and reshaped the way societies functioned. In this final part, we look at the enduring legacy of Mesopotamian ledgers, how they shaped empires beyond the rivers, how they gave birth to law and history, and how their boring precision still whispers into the present. Empires on clay. The Akkadian Empire, the first great Mesopotamian empire in the 3rd millennium BCE, stretched across vast lands. It was held together not only by the armies of Sargon and his successors, but by the bureaucratic system that tracked tribute and taxes. From conquered cities flowed grain, animals, and laborers, all entered into ledgers, all enforced through clay. Later, the Babylonians and Assyrians inherited and expanded these systems. Royal archives at Nineveh contained thousands of tablets, inventories of temples, accounts of labor, lists of tribute. Even military campaigns, remembered for their brutality, depended on such records. Armies had to be fed, supplies had to be accounted for. Without bureaucrats, there would be no empire. This was the paradox. Kings received glory, but it was the unseen scribes, scratching away day after day, who made the machinery of empire function. The law in clay. The most famous Mesopotamian document is the Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone in the 18th century BCE. Its tall stele, engraved with laws and punishments, is remembered as one of humanity's earliest legal codes. Yet Hammurabi's laws did not appear from nowhere. They grew from the bureaucratic habit of formula and repetition. The language of contracts, preserved in clay tablets long before Hammurabi, already had the rhythm of law. If X, then Y. If a field is sold, then these witnesses attest. If a loan is made, then these terms apply. Hammurabi did not invent law so much as elevate the style of record-keeping into a royal statement. His code was the monumental form of what scribes had already been doing for centuries. Once again, the boring tablets paved the way for greatness. What looked like sheep and barley lists became the framework of justice. History begins with ledgers. The Greek historian Herodotus famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile, but Mesopotamia's gift to the world was record-keeping. Writing spread from ledgers into royal inscriptions, myths, and chronicles. But even the grand narratives carried the imprint of bureaucracy. The king's triumphs were often recorded in the same style as economic tablets: year names, lists of spoils, inventories of captives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's first literary works, survived because scribes copied it onto tablets. Scribes trained first by copying sheep counts. Without bureaucracy, there would be no literature, no history, no memory. This is the irony of civilization. The beauty of human expression was built on the monotony of lists. The permanence of clay. Clay had one advantage: durability. Papyrus and parchment rot, paper burns, but clay, once dried or baked, can last millennia. Cities destroyed by fire inadvertently preserved their archives, the heat hardening tablets into near stone. Archaeologists now sift through their ruins, unearthing tablets by the thousands. Most tablets are not spectacular. They are dull lists, repeating the same formulas. Yet precisely because they are so numerous and so ordinary, they allow us to reconstruct the daily life of Mesopotamia with unusual clarity. We know how much grain a worker received, how much beer was allotted to women, how many sheep belonged to a temple herd. We know these things not because they were considered important at the time, but because bureaucracy recorded them relentlessly. Clay was not elegant, but it was eternal. Through it, boredom became immortality. Bureaucracy without end. The Mesopotamian system did not vanish. Successive civilizations built upon it. The Persians adopted administrative practices that echoed Babylonian methods. Greek city-states, though often disdainful of barbarian ways, also kept meticulous records of grain and tribute. Rome perfected bureaucracy with censuses, tax rolls, and imperial archives. Even today, the shadow of Mesopotamia lingers. Our receipts, contracts, and spreadsheets are descendants of those early tablets. We, too, live in a world where bureaucracy quietly underpins existence. We may sigh at tax forms or roll our eyes at endless paperwork, but these are the same tools that allowed the first cities to stand. The continuity is striking. Boredom as the bedrock of civilization. The Mesopotamian scribes, scratching away in hot rooms, would recognize in our offices something of their own monotony. Reflection. As you sink deeper into the story, think of the paradox. Humanity's first writing emerged not from a poet's inspiration but from an accountant's tally. Civilization began not with grandeur but with boredom. And yet, in those boring marks, pressed into clay by countless anonymous scribes, the future of law, literature, and memory was secured. The ledgers of Mesopotamia remind us that history is not always dramatic. Often it is tedious. But it is in the tedium, in the records, the lists, the repetition, that societies endure. The clay tablets still exist and they still whisper: sheep, barley, oil, beer. Their voices are dull, but they built the world. And so we leave Mesopotamia with this question. When future generations uncover the traces of our own age, will they find our poetry or only our spreadsheets? Will our monuments endure, or only the records of taxes filed, goods counted, debts owed? Perhaps, as in Mesopotamia, it will be the boring that proves eternal. You step into the past and imagine the sound of sandals striking stone. A steady rhythm, dozens of feet moving together, iron-shod boots of Roman legionaries marching down a long, straight road. The road stretches ahead, unbending, cutting through fields, hills, and forests with a persistence that feels unnatural. This is the Roman road, the most enduring infrastructure of antiquity, remembered for its reach and precision. But this story is not about conquest or the drama of legions. It is about the dull but vital matter of building and maintaining roads. For without maintenance, the stones would crumble, mud would swallow carts, and armies could not march. The Roman Empire depended on its roads, and its roads depended on the tedious work of countless laborers. To understand how Rome held together, we must walk slowly along these stones, paying attention not to the glory of generals, but to the boring details of roadwork. The purpose of roads. At first, Roman roads were military. The Republic needed to move soldiers quickly to defend or expand its territory. Roads allowed legions to march not only faster but straighter, bypassing obstacles by cutting through them rather than winding around. A road was an assertion of control. It said the land was conquered, ordered, and integrated. Soon, however, roads carried more than armies. Traders moved goods, officials traveled between provinces, messages sped across the empire. Merchants carried wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, and spices from the East. Taxes collected in kind, grain, wool, livestock moved along these same routes. And everyday people, farmers bringing produce to market, families relocating, pilgrims heading to shrines, walked where once only soldiers had marched. The roads were lifelines. Without them, the empire would fragment into isolated towns. With them, it became a network, humming with motion. Building the road. To build a Roman road was to labor with patience and precision. The process began with surveying. Roman engineers, agrimensors, used simple tools, wooden frames, cords, grammi, cross-shaped sighting instruments, to plot a straight line across the landscape. They rarely curved, preferring to cut through hills, build bridges, or lay causeways over marshes. Then came excavation. Workers dug a trench, sometimes several feet deep. Into this they placed layers, first large stones, then smaller gravel, then sand or crushed rock. Finally, paving stones, often basalt, were laid carefully, fitted so tightly that even centuries later the seams remained narrow. The surface was slightly convex, sloping to the sides for drainage. Ditches ran along the edges to carry away rainwater. This method was tedious, repetitive, and required countless hands. Slaves, soldiers, and local laborers toiled in the sun, breaking rock, hauling earth, laying stones. It was not glamorous work, but it created roads that endured not decades but centuries. Maintenance, the real work. Building was only the beginning. A road, once laid, demanded constant maintenance. Stones shifted, ditches clogged, weeds pushed through cracks. Carts with iron wheels ground ruts into the paving. Rain eroded embankments. Without care, a road would quickly become impassable. The Romans knew this, and they organized accordingly. Local communities were often responsible for upkeep. Wealthy landowners might be compelled to finance repairs. Soldiers, when not campaigning, were assigned to road work. Officials called curators viarum oversaw stretches of road, inspecting conditions, allocating funds, and ensuring repairs were made. Most maintenance was boring, endless labor, clearing ditches, resetting stones, patching ruts with gravel. Travelers might curse a rough patch, but behind its repair lay days of sweat and monotony. And yet, this monotony preserved the empire's arteries. The scale of the network. At its height, the Roman road system stretched over 250,000 miles, of which about 50,000 were stone-paved. Major routes radiated from Rome itself: the Via Appia to the south, the Via Flaminia to the north, the Via Aurelia along the coast. From these extended branches into every province, linking towns, forts, and ports. To grasp the scale, imagine standing at a milestone, an upright stone marker carved with the distance to Rome. Every mile another stone. Across Gaul, across Hispania, across the Balkans, these markers repeated. Each one was dull, formulaic, unremarkable. Yet together they mapped an empire. The system was not built all at once. It grew piecemeal, each road constructed for a specific purpose, later connected into a network. What unified it was not grand design, but the boring discipline of standardization. Layers, paving, milestones, maintenance. Life along the road. For ordinary Romans, roads were part of daily life. Farmers brought carts of produce to towns. Merchants trudged with goods packed on mules. Inns and way stations lined major routes, offering food, drink, and stables. At intervals, the mutations allowed fresh horses for official couriers. The cursus publicus, Rome's state postal system, depended on these stations to carry messages rapidly across the empire. Most travelers did not move far. A farmer might never leave the stretch of road between his village and the nearest market. But that small section was crucial, tying him into the larger economy. The great highway from Rome to Brundisium mattered little to him. The patch of road near his farm mattered immensely. And so, while generals and emperors boasted of roads, their true value was in the mundane steps of ordinary people walking them, day after day. The unresolved question. The stones of Roman roads still lie in place across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Some are buried, others visible, still usable. They are monuments to endurance, but also to maintenance. For centuries, men and women labored anonymously to keep them passable. And so we must ask, was the strength of Rome truly in its legions or in its maintenance crews? Did the empire endure because of conquest, or because of ditches cleared, stones reset, milestones carved? In the end, was Rome built more on glory or on boredom? The Roman roads stretched outward like veins, carrying lifeblood across the empire. But veins do not simply exist. They must remain open, unobstructed, flowing. To understand the power of Rome's roads, we must look not at the paving stones themselves, but at the systems that kept them functioning. The tolls, the taxes, the obligations, and the ceaseless flow of traffic. Roads were infrastructure, but they were also responsibility. It is easy to admire the grandeur of the Via Appia, its stones still visible outside Rome today. It is harder to imagine the villagers pressed into labor clearing weeds, or the provincial governor tallying funds to repair a bridge. Yet these quiet burdens were the cost of connectivity, and they reveal the deeper truth of Rome's endurance. That empire was sustained less by battles than by bureaucracy and maintenance. The economics of roads. Every empire needs revenue, and Rome was no exception. Roads facilitated trade, and trade generated taxes. A merchant bringing olive oil from Baetica, southern Spain, to Rome paid duties at ports, tolls on roads, and fees at markets. Each step of his journey depended on passable roads, and each toll collected along the way reinforced the cycle of maintenance. Some provinces established road taxes directly, assessed on landowners whose estates bordered major routes. Others required wealthy citizens to sponsor repairs as a form of public duty, an unglamorous but necessary contribution to civic life. Inscriptions survive honoring benefactors who financed road repairs. Most likely, these donors sought prestige, but their gifts were practical: a smoother surface for carts, a safer bridge for traffic. The economics of Roman roads were dull, full of numbers and obligations. But behind the boredom lay an engine of empire. A road was not only stone and gravel, it was a system of money, labor, and responsibility. Communication across distance. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, depended entirely on roads. Messages traveled by relay, carried by mounted couriers who changed horses at way stations. In this way, news could move astonishingly fast, hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Yet this speed was reserved for officials and the military. Ordinary people moved slowly, trudging along with carts and animals. For them, the road was not about swift communication but about steady connection. Markets were reachable, relatives visitable, festivals attendable. Roads shrank distance not by erasing time but by guaranteeing reliability. Still, the roads created a subtle shift in perception. Provinces once isolated now felt the pulse of Rome. Governors could send reports quickly, orders could be dispatched, armies summoned. The empire became not a collection of scattered lands but a web drawn tight by stone. And the web needed constant tending. Inns kept stocked, bridges kept safe, milestones kept upright. Each task small, dull, and necessary. The burden on communities. Road maintenance was not free. Local communities bore much of the burden. Peasants might be required to give labor for clearing ditches or hauling gravel. Landowners might be compelled to contribute funds. Soldiers, when not on campaign, were often put to work repairing roads in their provinces. For those at the bottom, this burden was resented. A farmer already toiling in fields might be pulled away to labor on a distant road. His absence meant less time for his crops, less food for his family. The empire demanded sacrifice not only in taxes but in sweat. Yet refusal was rarely an option. The road was a symbol of Rome, and to neglect it was to invite punishment. In this sense, roads were not only paths but instruments of control. They tied communities into Rome's system not just physically but economically, obligating them to sustain the very empire that ruled them. Trade on stone. For merchants, roads were lifelines. Grain from Egypt traveled largely by sea, but inland, goods moved on stone. Wine from Gaul, oil from Hispania, wool from Britannia, all flowed along Roman roads toward markets. Trade fairs and local markets thrived near intersections, where goods and people converged. The roads also allowed the spread of less tangible things, ideas, religions, fashions. Christianity, for instance, spread across Roman roads as missionaries and letters moved through the empire. Soldiers stationed at distant forts carried not only weapons but beliefs, customs, and habits. This was not the glamour of conquest but the monotony of motion, cartwheels grinding, animals trudging, feet shuffling mile after mile. Roads carried trade, but trade required wear and tear, and wear and tear required repair. The cycle repeated endlessly. The cost of neglect. When roads fell into disrepair, the consequences were immediate. Carts stuck in mud, bridges collapsed, travel slowed. Trade declined, taxes faltered, messages lagged. Military campaigns stumbled. Provinces far from Rome often struggled to maintain their stretches. In some cases, neglect lasted years until an imperial decree or wealthy benefactor intervened. The records of emperors boast of road repairs as achievements equal to victories. Augustus, for instance, proudly claimed to have restored the Via Flaminia. For him, the dull act of repair was an act of power, visible to every traveler. Neglect revealed the fragility of the system. Roads were strong, but they were not eternal. They demanded constant attention, and when attention failed, so too did Rome's grip. The unresolved question. And so we pause, standing at a crossroads paved nearly 2 millennia ago. The stones beneath our feet are worn by countless travelers, smoothed by wheels, repaired and re-repaired. They whisper of trade, of messages, of toil. But the question lingers. Did Rome's greatness lie in its ability to conquer, or in its ability to maintain? Was the empire's true strength in its generals, or in the peasants clearing weeds from ditches along the road. And if maintenance was its lifeblood, what happened when the will to maintain began to falter? The Roman Empire prided itself on permanence. Temples, baths, amphitheaters, each was built to endure, but none proved more lasting than the roads. Even as legions disbanded, provinces seceded, and emperors fell, the roads remained. They survived because they had to, because once laid they became indispensable. But they also survived because, for centuries, Rome invested not in their glory but in their upkeep. To trace the decline of Rome is, in part, to trace the neglect of its roads. And to understand Rome's legacy is to see how those same stones carried Europe into the Middle Ages and beyond. The slow decline. As the empire strained under invasions, economic troubles, and political fragmentation in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, road maintenance suffered. Provinces once tightly integrated into Rome's system found themselves underfunded, their labor diverted to defense rather than infrastructure. The cursus publicus, Rome's postal system, withered. Way stations fell into disuse, bridges collapsed unrepaired. Travel became slower, more dangerous. Merchants risked bandits where once the legions kept order. Communities still used the roads, they could not abandon them, but their condition worsened. By the 5th century, when the Western Empire fractured, the great road network no longer functioned as a unified system. It had become patchwork, some stretches maintained by local rulers, others neglected entirely. The roads did not vanish overnight. They simply lost their spine of organization. What had once been empire-wide discipline dissolved into local improvisation. Roads after Rome. In the centuries after Rome's fall, Europe continued to walk on Roman stones. Medieval kings, bishops, and merchants all relied on the same routes, even as they fell into disrepair. Pilgrims trudging to shrines in Santiago or Canterbury followed ancient alignments. Traders moved goods along roads whose origins they barely remembered. Some Roman roads became embedded in folklore. Devil's Causeways, old straight tracks, paths so enduring that people assumed supernatural origins. Farmers plowed around them, villages grew beside them, armies marched over them again and again. The roads were no longer systematically repaired, but their foundations were so solid that even neglect could not erase them. Bridges crumbled, paving stones disappeared, yet the roots persisted. The very landscape of Europe had been shaped by Roman engineering, and it could not be undone. The legacy of straight lines. What distinguished Roman roads was their directness. Earlier paths had meandered, following terrain. Romans preferred to impose order, cutting through hills, spanning rivers with bridges, laying causeways over marshes. These straight lines etched permanence into geography. Modern highways across Europe often follow the same alignments. The A1 in Britain traces the old Ermine Street. Routes in France echo the Via Agrippa. Italian motorways overlap with the Via Appia and Via Flaminia. To drive them today is, unknowingly, to follow footsteps 2,000 years old. The legacy is not the stones themselves, but the insistence that roads could shape landscapes, that human order could impose itself on nature. It was a philosophy of control, mundane, repetitive, yet transformative. Roads as memory. When we think of Rome, we remember emperors, legions, and monuments. Yet the truest memory of Rome is beneath our feet. Roads were the empire's connective tissue, holding its far-flung provinces together. Without them, messages would stall, trade would wither, armies would stumble. The persistence of these roads is a reminder that history is built less on spectacle than on maintenance. Each milestone carved, each ditch cleared, each stone reset was an act of continuity. The work was boring, but its results endure longer than marble statues or gilded temples. The empire is gone, but its roads remain, a memory etched into the land itself. Reflection. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine the countless hands that built and rebuilt these roads. Slaves breaking stones, soldiers filling ditches, peasants hauling gravel. Their names are lost, their labor forgotten, but their work still guides footsteps today. The Roman roads remind us that civilization is not sustained by glory alone. It endures through repetition, through the dull grind of upkeep. Empires fall, but maintenance leaves its mark. And so we close with a question. When our own infrastructure decays, when our bridges crumble and our highways crack, will anyone remember the labor that once sustained them? Will our descendants walk our roads as we still walk Rome? Or will they see only ruins and wonder what held us together? Close your eyes and picture the Sahara, not as an endless void but as a place of motion. The dunes rise and fall like waves frozen in time, wind shifting sand from one crest to another. The air is dry, the sun unrelenting. To survive here requires patience, resilience, and above all, knowledge. Yet through this harsh landscape, caravans once threaded their way, carrying goods that sustained kingdoms. The most precious of these goods was not gold, though West Africa was rich in it. It was not ivory, though elephants roamed the savannas. The true treasure of the desert was salt, white slabs hacked from mines, loaded onto camels and carried north and south along routes that seemed endless. Salt preserved food, flavored meals, and sustained life. Without it, communities withered. With it, empires thrived. The story of the salt routes is not one of drama or battle. It is a story of endurance, of long journeys measured in plodding camel steps, of repetitive exchanges carried out with ritual precision. It is a boring history, perhaps, but one that reveals how the most ordinary minerals shape the fate of kingdoms. Salt as necessity. Why salt? Because the human body cannot survive without it. Sweat leaches it out, heat demands more. For people living in the Sahel and Savannah, salt was as vital as water. In West Africa, where gold was plentiful, salt was scarce. In the Sahara, the reverse was true. Out of this imbalance grew trade networks that bound together desert nomads, Sahelian farmers, and coastal merchants. The salt of the Sahara was not table salt as we know it, neatly refined into crystals. It was hewn in slabs from mines at places like Tagheza and Taoudeni, remote settlements where laborers toiled in harsh conditions, cutting blocks from beneath the earth. The slabs were heavy, rough, unglamorous, yet each one carried immense value, enough to be exchanged weight for weight with gold in certain markets. Thus, a mineral that seemed ordinary became currency, shaping societies in ways few other resources could. The caravan, camels in endless lines. The key to salt trade was the camel. Introduced into North Africa around the early centuries CE, camels transformed the Sahara from an impassable barrier into a traversable highway. Unlike horses or donkeys, camels could endure days without water, carrying heavy loads while packing steadily across the sands. A salt caravan was a monotonous sight. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels moving in single file, each bearing 2 slabs of salt, tied in bundles on either side. The pace was slow, 20 to 25 miles a day, sometimes less. Drivers trudged alongside, wrapped in cloth against the sun, guiding animals with sticks and murmured commands. Day after day, the rhythm repeated. Wake before dawn, load camels, walk until heat forced a halt, rest, then continue into the evening. Nights were spent at desert wells or improvised camps, where fires burned low and conversation dwindled. The monotony was itself a survival strategy. Routine conserved energy, minimized error, and ensured the caravan reached its destination intact. Silent trade. One of the most intriguing features of this commerce was the practice of silent trade, used in some regions where language barriers or mistrust complicated exchanges. The process was simple but ritualized. Traders from the north would deposit slabs of salt at an agreed site, then withdraw. Local buyers, often bringing gold dust, would arrive, inspect the goods, and place their own offering beside the salt. They too withdrew. If the salt traders returned and judged the payment fair, they took it and left. If not, they waited until the gold was increased. No words were exchanged, no haggling spoken aloud. The silence ensured safety. Trade was completed without direct contact, reducing the risk of conflict. It was slow, repetitive, and perhaps inefficient by modern standards. But it worked. Over centuries, this silent rhythm built trust between peoples who might otherwise have remained strangers or enemies. Kingdoms built on salt. The prosperity of great West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, was tied to this trade. Salt moved south, gold moved north, and in between, cities like Timbuktu and Gao flourished as markets and cultural centers. Taxes levied on caravans enriched rulers, financing armies, palaces, and mosques. For the ordinary porter or camel driver, the wealth was invisible. Their lives were measured in miles walked, animals tended, loads balanced. They felt the weight of salt in their bones, the grind of sand in their teeth, the monotony of endless horizon. But their efforts sustained empires. Each step of a camel was a step in the building of kingdoms. The kings and scholars who ruled from stone cities owed their power not to battles alone, but to the slow, boring movement of salt across the desert. The unresolved question. As we stand in the desert night, listening to camels groan and wind hiss through dunes, we must ask, did the men who cut, carried, and traded salt understand their role in shaping empires? Or were they only enduring another day, another slab, another mile? Was history for them simply the weight of salt on a camel's back? The salt routes of the Sahara were not abstract lines across a map. They were walked, step, by men and animals who endured heat, thirst, monotony, and danger. Behind the wealth of kingdoms and the prestige of rulers lay the unseen lives of caravan workers, drivers, miners, guides, merchants, whose daily routines shaped the trade. Their stories, though rarely recorded, linger in traces, accounts from travelers, ruins of desert settlements, and the faint voices of tradition. To follow them is to understand that the salt trade was not only commerce, but survival. The desert demanded discipline, and discipline demanded repetition. It was a life of boredom, hardship, and endurance. The miners of Tagheza and Taoudeni. At the northern edge of the trade stood the salt mines themselves, bleak outposts where men labored under extremes. Tagheza, later replaced by Taoudeni, lay deep in the Sahara, a settlement built almost entirely from slabs of salt. Houses, mosques, even graves were constructed from the very mineral extracted there. The work was harsh. Miners cut blocks of salt from beneath the ground, hacking with simple tools in dim, suffocating shafts. Dust clogged their lungs, heat drained their strength. Food was scarce, supplies had to be brought from far away. Some miners were free men seeking wages, but many were enslaved, condemned to a life of monotony and exhaustion. The slabs they cut, rectangular, heavy, unremarkable, were stacked into piles, waiting for caravans. Each slab represented hours of toil, yet the miners rarely saw the wealth their work generated. For them, salt was not white gold, but heavy stone to be carved endlessly from the earth. The camel drivers. Once loaded onto camels, the salt left the mines in slow procession. Camel drivers, often from Tuareg or Berber communities, guided the caravan south. Their task was monotonous and relentless. Walk beside the animals, tend to their needs, keep the line moving. Camels groaned under their loads, their feet sinking into sand, their mouths frothing with fatigue. Drivers coaxed them forward with sticks and commands, pausing only when heat demanded rest. The desert offered little variety: dunes, gravel plains, occasional oases. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Yet the drivers were indispensable. They knew where the wells lay, how to navigate by stars, when to push forward and when to rest. Their knowledge was memory, passed from one generation to the next, preserved not in books but in footsteps. Without them, caravans would wander and perish. With them, the monotonous rhythm of progress endured. Life in the caravans. Caravan life revolved around routine. At dawn, camels were loaded, each bearing 2 slabs of salt, sometimes more. Loads were tied carefully. Imbalance could cripple an animal. Once the line was ready, the caravan moved in silence, the only sounds the thud of feet, the creak of leather straps, the sigh of wind. At midday the sun forced a halt. Animals knelt, drivers sought shade where none existed. Meals were meager, dates, millet, dried meat. Water was rationed strictly, measured by the skin. At night, fires were lit, and the caravan huddled together against the cold. This rhythm repeated endlessly. Progress was measured not in miles but in days survived. Each stage was a test of patience as much as endurance. To travel the salt route was to live in repetition, where boredom was a shield against despair. The markets and taxes. At the southern ends of the routes lay markets where salt met gold. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata became bustling hubs, their streets crowded with merchants and officials. Caravans unloaded their slabs, which were stacked in markets like bricks, awaiting buyers. Here, rulers asserted control through taxation. Every slab of salt, every sack of goods was subject to levy. Officials recorded quantities, collected payments, and ensured the flow of wealth into royal treasuries. These taxes, though dull in their precision, financed armies, built mosques, and supported scholars. For the merchant, taxes were a burden but an expected one. For the ruler, they were proof of authority. And for the ordinary worker, they were invisible, another layer of bureaucracy sustained by their toil. The ordinary uses of salt. What became of the salt once traded? Most of it was consumed in daily life. Families dissolved it in stews, sprinkled it on millet, used it to preserve fish and meat. Farmers fed it to livestock. Traders carried it to more remote villages. In some cases, salt itself served as currency. Slabs were broken into smaller pieces, exchanged directly for goods. In markets where coinage was scarce, salt was more reliable than minted metal. Thus, the dull slabs cut from Tagheza found their way into the most ordinary acts. A meal prepared, an animal fed, a trade conducted. The salt routes, stretching across deserts, ended in kitchens and corrals. The human cost. For every king enriched, there were countless workers exhausted. Miners coughing in shafts, camel drivers trudging in sand, traders sleeping under the open sky. Their lives were repetitive, often harsh, sometimes shortened by disease, injury, or exposure. And yet they endured. Communities formed around this trade, adapting to its demands. Songs were sung to ease monotony, prayers muttered before dangerous crossings, stories told at desert camps. The human spirit found ways to survive the boredom, even to dignify it. Still, the cost was heavy. For many, the salt trade meant not wealth but weariness. The unresolved question. As the caravan enters another stretch of desert, the horizon unbroken, we are left to wonder, did those who carried salt see themselves as part of a great system, or only as laborers in endless repetition? Did they know they were sustaining kingdoms, or did they measure life only in steps and slabs? And if their toil built empires, why has their memory faded, leaving only ruins and salt-stained stones? The salt routes of the Sahara were never glamorous. They lacked the drama of armies, the spectacle of palaces, or the splendor of art. Yet for nearly 1,000 years, they carried life itself across a desert that seemed determined to resist it. The caravans may have moved slowly, but their impact was vast, binding together regions, shaping kingdoms, and linking Africa to the wider world. This final chapter follows the arc of that story. How salt shaped empires, how the trade declined, and how its legacy still lingers in culture, memory, and the land itself. Salt and empire. The wealth of the great West African empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, depended on salt as much as on gold. The Ghana Empire, flourishing between the 8th and 11th centuries, taxed caravans moving through its territory, amassing revenue from salt slabs that passed like silent bricks of wealth. The Mali Empire, rising afterward, controlled trade routes and mines, channeling salt profits into armies and architecture. It was under Mali that Timbuktu blossomed, not only as a market but as a center of learning, where scholars debated law, astronomy, and theology. Songhai in the 15th and 16th centuries extended this system further, taxing salt at every stage. Its rulers commanded armies large enough to protect the caravans and extract tribute from distant markets. In each case, salt white, heavy, dull, underpinned the glitter of gold and the grandeur of kingship. Empires rose and fell, but the trade endured, its monotonous rhythm of slabs and camels outlasting dynasties. Decline of the roots. Nothing lasts forever, not even the white gold of the Sahara. By the 16th century, new trade routes were reshaping Africa. Portuguese ships, sailing along the Atlantic coast, bypassed the desert and brought salt by sea. Other goods, cloth, firearms, sugar, shifted the balance of commerce. The old caravan routes continued, but diminished. The great empires fractured under internal conflict and external pressure. Salt was still valued, but it was no longer the keystone of wealth it once had been. Mines like Tagheza and Taoudeni remained active, but the scale of their output lessened. By the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial powers redrew borders and imposed new economies. The salt caravans persisted in remote forms, but railways, trucks, and imported salt reduced their necessity. The age of endless camel lines fatting into the horizon was over. The desert, indifferent as ever, swallowed the traces of their passage. Ruins and memory. Today, the remnants of salt towns still stand. At Taoudeni, crumbling salt block houses linger, mute reminders of lives spent in monotony. Wells, once lifelines, are now filled with sand. The desert preserves, but it also erases. And yet memory endures in stories. Tuareg songs recall caravans, their rhythm echoing the steady pace of camels. Oral traditions preserve the names of oases, wells, and guides. In markets of Mali and Niger, slabs of desert salt are still traded, though often more symbolic than vital. For archaeologists and historians, the challenge is to piece together the story from fragments. Documents written by Arab travelers, accounts preserved in chronicles, oral traditions passed down through generations. The result is not dramatic, a picture of repetition, monotony, and endurance, but it is a history that mattered. The global thread. The salt routes of the Sahara were not isolated. They connected Africa to the Mediterranean and through it to the wider world. Gold from West Africa flowed north, enriching economies as far as Europe and the Middle East. Salt moved south, feeding livestock, preserving food, sustaining communities. The exchanges shaped global history indirectly. Without the salt-gold trade, West African kingdoms might never have risen to prominence. Without their gold, the economies of the Mediterranean might have faltered. The desert, so often imagined as empty, was in fact a channel of wealth that bound continents together. And all of it rested on the dull slabs hacked from desert mines and the endless plodding of camels. Reflection. The legacy of the Sahara's salt routes is not one of spectacle, but of endurance. They remind us that history is often built not on great battles or monuments, but on monotonous labor. The swing of a miner's pick, the step of a camel, the silent exchange of salt for gold. As you drift into thought, consider this. The men who carried slabs across the desert may not have seen themselves as makers of history. Yet without them, kingdoms would have withered, cities would have shrunk, scholars would have gone unfunded. Theirs was a history of boredom, yet it sustained greatness. And so the question lingers. When we look back at our own world centuries from now, will history remember the spectacular events, or the quiet, repetitive labor that made them possible? Will our monuments survive, or only the echoes of our routines? Imagine a city that has vanished from memory, its name buried for 4,000 years beneath layers of dust. In the 1970s, archaeologists working in northern Syria uncovered the ruins of Ebla, an ancient city-state that thrived in the 3rd millennium BCE. Its palaces had crumbled, its walls collapsed, but in storerooms deep beneath the rubble they found something extraordinary: thousands of clay tablets, inscribed with cuneiform writing. At first glance, the discovery promised drama, perhaps epic poetry, tales of conquest, or hymns to the gods. But when scholars began to read the tablets, they found something else entirely. Most were lists, inventories of goods, records of rations, contracts, diplomatic letters. They were the dull paperwork of a long-dead city, preserved by chance in clay. And yet these boring tablets reveal a world. They tell us how Ebla fed its people, how it governed its lands, how it traded with neighbors. They are windows not into spectacle, but into routine, the routines that made a city-state prosper in the ancient Near East. The city of Ebla. Ebla was not a minor settlement. Around 2500 BCE, it was a thriving urban center, home to perhaps 20,000 people. Its walls enclosed palaces, temples, workshops, and houses. Its wealth came from trade: textiles, metals, timber, and agricultural goods. Located between Mesopotamia to the east and the Levant to the west, Ebla stood at a crossroads of commerce. Kings ruled, but their authority rested on the machinery of administration. Taxes had to be collected, goods distributed, rations measured, alliances maintained. For this, scribes filled storerooms with tablets. When fire eventually consumed the palace, the heat baked the clay hard, preserving what would otherwise have crumbled. By accident, Ebla's bureaucracy became eternal. Today, those tablets are our main voice from the city. They do not sing, but they speak. What the tablets contain. Most of Ebla's tablets are inventories. They list sheep, goats, cattle, animals tallied for temple offerings, royal banquets, or redistribution. Others record textiles counted in bolts of cloth, metals weighed in ingots, wood measured in logs. Some are ration lists, specifying how much grain or oil each worker received. To the modern reader, these lists seem unbearably monotonous. The same words repeat, the same numbers vary only slightly, and yet within them lies the fabric of daily life. We see the scale of herds, the productivity of fields, the diet of workers. We glimpse the machinery of governance in action, boring but effective. A few tablets record treaties or letters, offering flashes of politics and diplomacy. But even these are framed in bureaucratic language: agreements to deliver goods, pledges of loyalty, stipulations about tribute. The excitement of power is buried in formulaic phrases. Ebla's voice is that of an office, not a battlefield. The scribes of Ebla. Behind every tablet was a scribe, trained to master cuneiform signs. In Ebla, scribes wrote in Sumerian, the prestige language of the region, though they spoke their own Semitic tongue. To learn the script required years of repetition, copying symbols, memorizing lists, practicing calculations. The scribes worked in offices within the palace, smoothing clay tablets, pressing styluses, stacking records in shelves. Their work was not glamorous. They spent hours inscribing numbers, double-checking totals, filing documents. Yet they were indispensable. Without them, the city could not track its herds, supply its armies, or tax its people. In training exercises, scribes often copied word lists, names of animals, plants, professions, places. These lists were as dull as they sound, but they preserved knowledge, standardized language, and connected Ebla's bureaucracy to broader Mesopotamian traditions. The boredom of practice built the skill of governance. The reach of bureaucracy. What do these tablets tell us about Ebla's society? They reveal a state deeply concerned with control. Officials monitored livestock in distant villages, textiles produced by workshops, goods sent as tribute. Women and men both appear in ration lists, suggesting a workforce divided by gender and status. One tablet might record that 10 sheep were sent to a temple, another that 30 measures of grain were distributed to workers, another that a royal household received jars of oil. Each entry is small, but together they map an economy. Ebla's rulers govern not by whim but by numbers, sustained by endless accounting. It was, in its way, a triumph of administration, and yet it was fragile. A system so dependent on record-keeping could collapse if the records were lost or ignored. The very bureaucracy that made Ebla strong also made it rigid. The ordinary hidden in lists. Though the tablets are dry, they contain glimpses of ordinary life. The ration lists show how much barley a worker ate, how much oil a family received. The textile accounts hint at clothing production, perhaps the garments worn by nobles and commoners alike. The livestock records reveal which animals were valued, which sacrificed, which consumed. These details, scattered across thousands of tablets, build a picture of life in Ebla more vivid than monuments alone. They show us not only kings and temples, but meals, clothes, and work. They remind us that civilization rests on ordinary acts, feeding workers, clothing families, balancing accounts. Without the boring tablets, we would know little of Ebla. With them, we see the city not in myth but in reality. The unresolved question. As we stand in Ebla's ruined palace, the shelves of tablets imagined back into place, we must ask, did the scribes who pressed wedges into clay realize they were preserving their world for millennia? Or did they see only another day of work, another list to complete, another number to tally? Was history, for them, nothing more than boredom on clay? Ebla's story is not told in soaring monuments or epic inscriptions. It is written instead in the dull rhythm of administration, in the endless rows of numbers and names etched into clay. These tablets show us a city not driven by dramatic conquest but by the slow pulse of bureaucracy. In their monotony, they reveal how governance was practiced, not in speeches or battles, but in ledgers and lists. To understand Ebla's significance, we must look beyond the boredom of its tablets to the systems they reflect. Diplomacy as protocol, economy as measurement, and culture as repetition. Diplomatic ledgers. Among the tens of thousands of tablets, a fraction record treaties and agreements. These were not grand manifestos, but formulaic contracts, lists of goods exchanged, terms of tribute, obligations between rulers. One treaty might stipulate that a neighboring city deliver so many measures of silver or so many flocks of sheep each year. Another might record Ebla's promise to provide textiles in exchange for timber or metals. The agreements were dull, but binding. They allowed rulers to manage relationships without constant warfare. In these formulae, diplomacy became bureaucracy. Trust was not placed in words spoken but in terms inscribed. Officials could check obligations against written records, ensuring consistency. What seems monotonous to us was, for them, a mechanism of stability. Economy by numbers. The bulk of the Ebla tablets concern resources, livestock, textiles, foodstuffs. These were the building blocks of the city's economy. The precision is striking. A tablet might list 237 sheep sent to one temple, 43 to another. Another might record 1,000 bolts of cloth distributed as tribute. Each number, though mundane, was part of a larger pattern. Through these records, we see how wealth was accumulated and redistributed. Temples acted not only as religious centers but as economic hubs, receiving offerings and managing resources. Palaces, too, were storehouses, their officials tracking inflows and outflows meticulously. The monotony of lists was not accidental, it was essential. By reducing life to numbers, Ebla could manage complexity. Numbers stripped away uncertainty, allowing rulers to know, at least in theory, how much they possessed and how much they could demand. The role of women. One of the surprising details within Ebla's tablets is the presence of women in administrative life. Ration lists include women alongside men, often working in textile production or serving in palace households. Some tablets even reference female officials, suggesting that women held positions of responsibility. This presence emerges not in dramatic stories, but in dry entries. So many measures of oil to women workers, or X rations for the household of the queen. Yet these small details speak volumes. They show women integrated into the machinery of economy, their labor recorded and valued in the same monotonous format as men's. Without the dull repetition of such entries, this aspect of Ebla's society might be invisible to us. Standardization as power. Ebla's tablets reflect not only administration, but a deliberate effort to standardize. Lists of words, animals, plants, professions were copied as exercises by scribes. These were not casual notes, but teaching tools designed to ensure uniformity in record keeping. This standardization connected Ebla to the wider Mesopotamian world. By using Sumerian signs and conventions, Ebla's scribes aligned themselves with the broader tradition of cuneiform administration. In doing so, they ensured that Ebla's records could be understood by other states, strengthening trade and diplomacy. The boredom of repetition was thus political. Every copied list was a rehearsal of power, a way to embed the city into a shared bureaucratic culture. Bureaucracy and control. The tablets reveal how deeply administration penetrated daily life. Taxes were collected in kind grain, livestock, cloth, and carefully logged. Officials oversaw villages, workshops, and temples, reporting quantities to the palace. Workers received rations calculated to sustain but not enrich. The effect was control through monotony. Life became measurable, predictable, accountable. A farmer's harvest, a weaver's output, a herder's flock, all were reduced to entries in clay. Bureaucracy turned the unpredictable flow of life into orderly lists. Yet this control came at a cost. It relied on constant oversight, endless recording, and a class of scribes dedicated to detail. The system was strong but also rigid. When crises came, drought, war, rebellion, the bureaucracy could not adapt quickly. Its strength in stability was also a weakness in flexibility. The weight of routine. For the scribes themselves, the work was unrelenting. Each day brought more lists to inscribe, more numbers to tally, more formulae to repeat. Their lives were governed by stylus and tablet, their memory shaped by the monotony of administration. Did they find satisfaction in the precision or only weariness? Did they see themselves as serving kings and gods or only as filling shelves with clay? The tablets do not tell us. They preserve the results, not the feelings. But in their silence, they remind us that much of history is built not on passion but on routine. The machinery of Ebla was dull, but it worked, until it didn't. The unresolved question. Standing amid the ruins of Ebla, we face a puzzle. How could such a vast system, so carefully recorded, vanish so completely? How could a city-state that measured everything in detail disappear so thoroughly that its very name was forgotten for millennia? Was bureaucracy a safeguard, or a burden too heavy to sustain in times of crisis? Did the monotony that once preserved order eventually stifle resilience? The story of Ebla does not end in the monotonous hum of bureaucrats scratching clay. Like so many ancient cities, it ended in fire and silence. Yet even in collapse, the city left behind what it valued most, its records. Preserved by destruction, Ebla's clay tablets became its most enduring monument. They tell us not of glory, but of governance. In this final section, we trace how Ebla fell, how its memory vanished, and how archaeologists in the modern era uncovered its bureaucratic treasure. We end with reflections on the legacy of boring administration, how it both sustained and limited a society, and how its dull endurance still shapes how we understand the past. The fall of Ebla. Sometime around 2300 BCE, Ebla fell. The exact cause is debated. Some scholars believe the city was destroyed by the Akkadian Empire under Sargon or his grandson Naram-Sin, as Mesopotamia's first great empire expanded westward. Others suggest internal decline or conflict with rival city-states. What we know is that the palace burned. Fire consumed wood and plaster, toppled walls and collapsed roofs. Yet in this destruction lay preservation. The heat baked the thousands of clay tablets stored in palace archives, hardening them into near stone. What might have disintegrated over millennia instead endured. Ebla was rebuilt, but it never regained its former prominence. Over centuries, it faded into obscurity, its name forgotten, its history erased. By the time classical civilizations arose, Ebla was a memory buried beneath the soil. Silence for millennia. For more than 4,000 years, Ebla was silent. Travelers passed over its ruins, shepherds grazed flocks nearby, but none knew the city's name. Its palaces crumbled into low mounds of earth, indistinguishable from natural hills. The world moved on. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, all rose and fell while Ebla lay hidden. Its records, once vital, sat unread in darkness. The careful lists of sheep, the treaties of kings, the rations of workers, all lost to memory. The bureaucracy that had so meticulously captured life had become useless, preserved but unread. Ebla's silence was itself a lesson. Bureaucracy may endure, but its meaning depends on context. A list without readers is no different from dust. Rediscovery. In the 1960s and 1970s, Italian archaeologists began excavating the mound of Tel Marduk in northern Syria. At first, they uncovered statues and inscriptions that hinted at a city of significance. Then, in 1974, they found a storeroom filled with tablets, thousands of them, stacked on shelves, some still in neat order as they had fallen when the palace collapsed. The discovery was staggering. Scholars realized they had found a major city-state from the 3rd millennium BCE, previously unknown. As the tablets were deciphered, the name Ebla re-emerged into history after 4,000 years of silence. What they revealed was not drama, but detail. Inventories, contracts, treaties, ration lists. The excitement of discovery quickly gave way to the monotony of translation. But in that monotony lay treasure. For the first time, historians could reconstruct the daily workings of a Bronze Age city with unusual clarity. Lessons from bureaucracy. Ebla's tablets remind us that administration is as central to civilization as armies or temples. The city rose because it measured, taxed, and controlled. It thrived because it tracked resources and maintained order. Its greatness was not in spectacle but in routine. Yet bureaucracy also has limits. It creates stability, but also rigidity. Ebla's fall suggests that careful records could not protect against external conquest or internal weakness. A city can count its sheep with precision and still lose them to enemies. The legacy is paradoxical. Bureaucracy is essential but not sufficient. It sustains life, but it cannot alone guarantee survival. Modern reflections. Today, Ebla's tablets sit in museums and archives, studied by scholars who patiently decipher their cuneiform signs. They are tedious to read, repetitive in content, but invaluable in meaning. Through them, we glimpse the labor of workers, the policies of kings, the rhythms of daily life. Their endurance is a reminder that boredom is sometimes history's most powerful tool. Epic poems can be lost, monuments destroyed, but a storeroom of bureaucratic lists can survive millennia. In their monotony lies memory. And so, as you imagine the scribes of Ebla pressing styluses into wet clay, think of how their dull routine outlasted their city, their rulers, and even their gods. Their boredom became immortality. Reflection. Ebla's story leaves us with a final question. When our own records are uncovered thousands of years from now, what will they say? Will they preserve our literature and art, or only our spreadsheets and tax forms? Will history remember our monuments, or only our bureaucracies? Perhaps, like Ebla, the boring will prove more durable than the spectacular. Imagine standing in a city more than 4,000 years old, where the air is heavy with dust, the streets laid out in a careful grid, and the houses built from uniform baked bricks. This is Mohenjo-Daro, one of the great urban centers of the Indus Valley civilization. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, its monuments were not towering structures of kingship. Instead, its pride lay in something quieter: water. The Indus people built wells, drains, and bathing platforms with a precision unmatched in the ancient world. Their greatness was not in conquest or drama, but in sanitation and infrastructure. Theirs was a civilization of order, maintenance, and routine. In the daily act of fetching water, washing, and draining waste, the Indus people wrote their history in bricks and channels. This story is not about battles or rulers. None are known by name. It is about the boring but profound ways a civilization sustained itself, through wells dug deep, drains laid straight, and rituals performed with water. The wells of the city. Mohenjo-Daro was dotted with wells, hundreds of them. Some were private, inside courtyards of houses. Others stood along streets for communal use. Built of carefully stacked baked bricks, they descended deep into the earth to reach the water table. Steps sometimes led down to the water, allowing easier access. These wells were not grand, but they were essential. Each provided clean water for drinking, cooking, and washing. Their abundance suggests that water was central to urban life, not a scarce luxury but a managed necessity. Unlike many ancient cities, where water was fetched from distant rivers, the people of Mohenjo-Daro could draw water just steps from their doors. It is a detail so ordinary that it is easy to overlook, but in its ordinariness lies significance. A city built not on monuments, but on access to water. Drains beneath the streets. Equally striking were the drains. Along the streets of Mohenjo-Daro ran covered channels, built of brick, carrying wastewater away from houses. Side drains connected homes to the main lines, ensuring that runoff from bathing platforms and kitchens did not stagnate. Inspection holes and soak pits were placed at intervals, allowing maintenance and filtration. This was not glamorous work. To design, dig, and maintain drains required constant effort. Workers had to clear blockages, repair bricks, and manage flow. The system was not perfect. Archaeologists note uneven construction in places, but it was astonishing for its time. For the people of the Indus, waste was not ignored. It was managed. Theirs was a civilization of maintenance, of boring labor carried out day after day to keep the city livable. Bathing as ritual. Water was not only practical, it was cultural. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a large brick-lined tank in the center of the city, suggests ritual bathing. Steps led down into the pool, and bitumen sealed its floor to prevent leakage. Surrounding rooms may have housed priests or attendants. What ceremonies took place here, we do not know. No texts survive to explain. But the care taken in construction, the central location, and the emphasis on water all suggest that bathing was more than hygiene. It was meaning, identity, perhaps even spirituality. In smaller houses, too, bathing platforms appear, simple brick pavements with drains leading outward. For families, bathing was routine, woven into daily life. The act of washing, repeated endlessly, connected the practical with the symbolic. The grid of order. Mohenjo-Daro's layout was deliberate. Streets ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles. Houses were built with standard brick sizes. Wells, drains, and bathing platforms appeared in consistent patterns. This order was not accidental. It reflected a society that valued regulation, standardization, and maintenance. The grid was not only a plan of streets, it was a plan of life. Each household fit into the system, each drain connected to the whole. There were no known kings, no grand royal palaces, no monumental inscriptions proclaiming power. The power of the Indus lay in order itself, expressed in the monotony of brick, the regularity of wells, the the repetition of drains. Archaeological discovery. When archaeologists uncovered Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, they were struck not by monumental temples or statues, but by infrastructure. Streets, wells, drains, and bathing platforms dominated the ruins. It was a city built not for spectacle but for survival. At first this seemed boring, rows of bricks, endless drains. But soon, scholars realized its importance. The Indus Valley civilization, contemporary with Mesopotamia and Egypt, was unique in its focus on sanitation and planning. Where others built pyramids or ziggurats, the Indus built plumbing. It was not dramatic, but it was revolutionary. The unresolved question. As we stand amid the brick ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, looking at wells that still descend into the earth, drains that still line the streets, and bathing platforms worn smooth by use, we must ask, why did this civilization choose order over monument? Why did it pour its energy into sanitation rather than spectacle? Was it a conscious philosophy, or simply the habit of routine? Civilizations are remembered for what they valued. Egypt valued the afterlife, carving pyramids to house kings. Mesopotamia valued order through writing, inscribing laws and ledgers into clay. The Indus Valley civilization, by contrast, seems to have valued water, its access, its cleanliness, its management. Nowhere is this clearer than in the monotony of wells, drains, and bathing platforms that filled its cities. But to see water as only practical would be too narrow. The Indus people made water a way of life, embedding it into routine, ritual, and even identity. To fetch, to wash, to drain, these were not spectacular acts, but their repetition sustained the city. In that repetition, we glimpse the character of a civilization. Fetching water. In Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, wells dotted the landscape, some shared by neighborhoods, others enclosed within houses. To fetch water was a daily task, repeated countless times. A woman might lower a clay jar, fill it, balance it on her head, and carry it back to her courtyard. A child might help, learning the rhythm of the task. This routine has no grandeur, yet it structured life. The well was a gathering point, where neighbors exchanged greetings, where gossip flowed as freely as water. Archaeologists imagine these moments from the wear on steps, the polish of brick edges smoothed by centuries of hands and feet. Water fetched was divided, some for drinking, some for cooking, some for bathing, some for livestock. Each measure counted, each jar precious. In a city where water was abundant, its management still required care. Bathing as routine. The bathing platforms of Indus houses were small, simple spaces, brick floors, slightly sloped to channel water into a drain. They suggest that washing was a daily practice, not a rare indulgence. Unlike later societies, where bathing was often communal or occasional, the Indus people seem to have valued private, frequent washing. This routine was boring, unremarkable, yet revolutionary. Cleanliness reduced disease, preserved dignity, and perhaps expressed spiritual values. The Great Bath, on a larger scale, suggests that ritual bathing held communal significance. But in the countless small platforms of ordinary houses, we see the discipline of repetition. Water poured, bodies washed, drains cleared. It was not spectacle, but it was civilization. Drains and maintenance. The Indus drains were not self-sustaining. They required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated, weeds intruded, bricks shifted. Workers, likely laborers assigned by neighborhoods or authorities, cleared blockages, replaced bricks, and kept water flowing. This was tedious work, invisible when done well, only noticed when neglected. A blocked drain could flood a street or foul a courtyard. Preventing such problems demanded vigilance. The monotony of maintenance reveals a truth. Civilizations endure not through dramatic acts, but through endless small labors. The workers of Mohenjo-Daro, bent over drains with tools in hand, were as vital as any ruler or priest. Their boredom kept the city clean. Ritual and symbol. Water in the Indus Valley was not only practical. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro points to ritual. Scholars debate its meaning: purification before ceremonies, communal gatherings, symbolic renewal. The absence of texts leaves only speculation. But the effort invested in the Great Bath, its watertight lining, its monumental scale, its central position, shows that water carried symbolic weight. Rituals require repetition, and repetition requires infrastructure. To bathe in the Great Bath was to participate in a cycle as old as the city itself, descending steps, immersing, emerging renewed. In this way, the daily and the sacred overlapped. The same act, washing, was both ordinary and transcendent depending on context. In either case, it was routine that shaped meaning. Social discipline. The uniformity of wells, drains, and bathing platforms across the city suggests a shared cultural discipline. It was not one palace or one temple imposing standards, but neighborhoods adopting common practices. The grid of streets, the standard size of bricks, the regularity of infrastructure, all point to collective order. This order required compliance. To build a house meant aligning it to the street grid, connecting it to the drainage system, maintaining its facilities. Each family participated in the larger system, whether by design or by habit. Civilization was sustained not by the command of kings, but by the discipline of households repeating the same routines. It was boring, but it was powerful. The invisible workers, who dug the wells, who laid the bricks, who cleared the drains. Their names are lost, but their labor endures. The infrastructure of the Indus was not the work of rulers alone, but of countless workers whose lives were spent in monotony. Archaeologists find traces: worn tools, broken bricks, silt in drains, ash from kilns that baked bricks by the thousands. Each trace is a fragment of labor. Each laborer contributed to a system larger than themselves, yet their own stories are silent. Civilization rests on such silence. Behind the grandeur of order is the boredom of work. The unresolved question. As we imagine the wells, drains, and baths of the Indus, we are left to wonder: did the people of Mohenjo-Daro see their routines as extraordinary or only as life? Did they view water as sacred order or simply as necessity? Was the greatness of their civilization intentional or merely the byproduct of ordinary repetition? Civilizations do not fall in a single moment. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, until only ruins remain. The Indus Valley civilization, with its grids of streets, its countless wells, and its drains whispering with water, flourished for centuries. Then, around 1900 BCE, it declined. The reasons remain uncertain: climate change, shifting rivers, overuse of land, trade disruptions, or political fragmentation. But whatever the causes, its water systems, once the pride of its cities, fell silent. To understand the end of the Indus story, we must look not at monuments of kings, for there were none, but at infrastructure. The decline of wells, drains, and bathing rituals mirrors the decline of the civilization itself. Yet even in collapse, the legacy of water endures. The decline of urban life. Archaeologists note a gradual change in the late phases of the Indus cities. Wells were abandoned, drains clogged with silt, bathing platforms fell into disrepair. Houses shrank in size, streets narrowed, bricks lost their standardization. The meticulous order that once defined Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa gave way to irregularity. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow fatting. The discipline of maintenance weakened. Without constant clearing, drains became useless. Without shared standards, construction grew haphazard. The monotony that once sustained the city gave way to neglect. Urban life dwindled. Populations moved outward into villages, where small-scale wells and local practices replaced grand urban systems. The grid dissolved into rural scatter. Civilization shifted, leaving behind the ghost of its order. Possible causes. Why did this happen? Scholars debate. Climate change. Evidence suggests the Indus region became drier around 2000 BCE, rivers shifting their courses, rainfall decreasing. Wells may have sunk deeper, but eventually, water became harder to sustain. Trade disruption. The Indus civilization traded with Mesopotamia. When Mesopotamian demand waned, wealth may have declined, reducing resources for urban maintenance. Overuse of land. Intensive farming and deforestation may have weakened the environment, making cities less viable. Internal strain. A system that relied so heavily on routine and maintenance may have lacked resilience in the face of crisis. Each explanation is partial. Together, they suggest that the very order of the Indus, its dependence on predictable water management, was also its vulnerability. The mystery of collapse. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus left no royal inscriptions, no chronicles of decline. We do not know the names of its rulers, the words of its laws, or the prayers of its priests. Its script remains undeciphered, its voices silent. This silence deepens the mystery. When Mohenjo-Daro's wells dried, when its drains clogged, did its people realize they were living through the end of an age? Or did they simply adapt, moving outward, continuing routines elsewhere? Perhaps collapse was not felt as catastrophe but as transition. What seems to us an ending may have been, for them, simply another phase of life. Survival beyond the cities. Though the great cities faded, the practices of water management endured. Villages in the Indus region continued to dig wells, channel runoff, and value cleanliness. The habits of order did not vanish with Mohenjo-Daro. They lived on in smaller forms. In later Indian traditions, the emphasis on bathing and purification persisted. Ritual immersion in rivers, daily washing, and the symbolic role of water may trace their roots back to the Indus. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, though mute, may echo faintly in the rituals of the Ganges thousands of years later. Thus, the legacy of water was not lost. It shifted, adapted, and survived. Archaeological legacy. For modern archaeologists, the water systems of the Indus are a source of endless fascination. Excavations reveal drains running beneath streets, wells still intact, brick platforms worn smooth. These are not monuments to kings, but to maintenance. The excitement of discovery quickly becomes the tedium of cataloging. Another well, another drain, another row of bricks. Yet in this repetition lies the greatness of the Indus. It is a civilization defined not by spectacle but by boredom, and in that boredom lies resilience. What other society of the ancient world invested so much in sanitation? What other people made water management their central achievement? The monotony of the Indus is what sets it apart. Reflection. As you drift with this story, picture the silent drains of Mohenjo-Daro, once carrying water, now choked with earth. Picture the wells, still reaching down, their water long gone. Picture the Great Bath, empty but enduring. These are not ruins of kingship, but ruins of routine. The Indus people remind us that civilization is sustained not by spectacle, but by repetition. Water fetched, drains cleared, bodies washed. Their greatness was boring, but it mattered. And so we are left with a question. When our own systems falter, our pipes, our sewers, our grids, will archaeologists one day read our story in the ruins of plumbing? Will they see our civilization not in monuments but in maintenance? When most people think of the Andes, they imagine the Inca, great stone walls, Machu Picchu perched on a ridge, armies stretching across mountains. Yet centuries before the Inca, long before Cusco rose as an imperial capital, anonymous farmers carved the slopes of the Andes into terraces. Their work was not dramatic, not sung in epics or inscribed on monuments. It was slow, repetitive, and endless, moving stones, leveling earth, channeling water. These terraces, stacked step by step across mountainsides, were the foundation of Andean civilization. Without them, no empire could have risen, no city could have thrived. They were boring to build, boring to maintain, and boring to use. Yet in their monotony, they transformed mountains into farmland and scarcity into surplus. This story begins not with kings, but with farmers bent over stones, placing them one by one, creating walls that held back soil against gravity and time. The challenge of the Andes. The Andes are a formidable landscape: steep slopes, thin air, unpredictable weather, and soils easily washed away by rain. For early settlers, farming such terrain seemed nearly impossible. Flat land was scarce, rivers cut deep valleys, and frost could strike at unexpected times. Yet people lived here thousands of years before the Inca. Survival demanded ingenuity. Rather than fight the mountains, they reshaped them. Step by step, slope by slope, they carved terraces, narrow, flat platforms supported by stone walls, where soil could accumulate and crops could grow. It was not glamorous work. It was maintenance on a civilizational scale, but it worked. Building the terraces. To build a terrace, farmers first cleared stones from a slope, piling them to form a retaining wall. Behind this wall, they leveled soil, often carrying earth from other places. Drainage channels were dug to prevent erosion, and paths were left for movement. The process was repetitive and laborious. Every stone had to be placed carefully. Every wall required constant repair. Rain, frost, and gravity pressed against the structures, demanding vigilance. A terrace was never finished. It was maintained across generations. Yet once built, it transformed the land. Slopes became ladders of fields, each step catching water, preserving soil, and moderating temperature. The boring work of stone moving created a miracle of adaptation. Crops of the high Andes. On these terraces, farmers grew potatoes, quinoa, beans, and maize. Each crop had its altitude. Potatoes thrived higher, maize lower, quinoa in between. Terraces allowed farmers to extend the range of each crop, creating microclimates that made agriculture more reliable. The diversity of crops was not accidental, it was insurance. If frost killed maize, potatoes survived. If drought reduced quinoa, beans endured. Terraces multiplied these chances, spreading risk across levels of land. What seems like dull detail, potatoes here, beans there, maize elsewhere, was in fact survival strategy. The monotony of planting season after season sustained life where nature offered little. Water management. Terraces were nothing without water. Farmers built canals to divert streams, directing flow from one level to the next. Excess water drained down through channels, preventing erosion. Some terraces even had underground drainage to avoid saturation. This system required constant oversight. Canals had to be cleared of debris, channels reshaped after rains, walls reinforced where water leaked. It was daily, boring labor, but without it, terraces would collapse in a single season. The invisible hands of countless workers kept the mountains alive with crops. A landscape of labor. When viewed from a distance, terrace slopes resemble vast staircases climbing into the sky. But up close, they reveal the endless touch of human effort. Walls patched with stones of different sizes, soil leveled again and again, channels cleaned by hand. These were not monuments built once and admired forever. They were living systems, demanding constant attention. A single family might tend the same terrace for centuries, repairing the same wall, redigging the same channel, repeating the same tasks. The terraces embody history as maintenance. Their grandeur is not in spectacle, but in persistence. Archaeological traces. Archaeologists studying the Andes find terraces in countless valleys, some abandoned, others still in use. Dating them is difficult, for they were maintained across centuries, rebuilt and reused. Some predate the Inca by more than 1,000 years. Others were expanded during imperial times. The challenge of excavation is often monotony. Walls of stone, layer after layer of soil, channels filled with silt. Yet within this repetition lies knowledge. The depth of soil reveals centuries of cultivation. The wear on stones shows generations of labor. The alignment of canals demonstrates planning passed down over time. It is boring archaeology, but it uncovers a civilization of endurance. The unresolved question. As we stand on a terrace slope, the stones still in place after 1,000 years, we must ask, did the farmers who built them see their work as history or only as necessity? Did they imagine empires rising on their labor or only another season's harvest? Was their greatness intentional or only the byproduct of boredom repeated across generations? Terraces may look like stone and soil, but they are also social structures. Each wall represents not only labor but coordination, not only maintenance but community. To build and sustain a terrace system required families, neighbors, and entire villages to work together, year after year, season after season. The Andes were not a landscape of isolated farms. They were a mosaic of shared labor, a society knit together by the monotony of agriculture in difficult terrain. In the repetition of planting, watering, and repairing, communities forged resilience. And in the discipline of terrace life, they created the foundation for empires that would later rise above them. Organizing the work. No terrace was built alone. The walls were too large, the soil too heavy, the task too repetitive. Farmers worked in groups, extended families, kin networks, and neighbors gathered to haul stones, dig earth, and shape channels. This was labor that blurred the line between duty and necessity. Helping a neighbor meant ensuring that your own fields would also be supported, for a collapsed terrace could damage those below. Responsibility cascaded down the slope. Thus, cooperation was not just kindness, but survival. The work followed seasonal rhythms. After harvest, walls were repaired. Before planting, channels were cleared. In between, families tended crops and animals, weaving social life into agricultural cycles. Storage and surplus. Terraces allowed the Andes to produce more food than narrow valleys alone could yield. With surplus came storage. Farmers built granaries to hold potatoes, quinoa, and maize, carefully dried and preserved. Underground pits protected tubers from frost. Storage meant security. In good years, families could set aside food for lean ones. Communities could share reserves, redistribute during shortages, and support larger populations. The surplus also freed some people for other roles: craftsmen, traders, builders of temples. But at the base of it all remained the terrace farmers, whose routine labor made abundance possible. Rituals of labor. In Andean culture, labor was often ritualized. Work parties might be accompanied by music, chanting, or communal feasts. Chicha, a fermented maize drink, was brewed and shared. Songs synchronized lifting stones or digging soil, turning monotony into rhythm. These rituals transformed dull labor into community bonding. Terraces became not only agricultural infrastructure, but stages for social life. A repaired wall or a cleared canal was not just a task completed, it was a celebration of cooperation. Even today, in Andean villages where terraces are still maintained, communal work is marked by shared meals and festivals. The rhythm of labor continues to carry the echo of ancient rituals. Social hierarchies. Though terraces encouraged cooperation, they also reflected inequality. Some families controlled larger or better placed terraces, producing more surplus. Elites could command labor from others, demanding help in exchange for protection or access to water. Archaeologists find evidence of larger storage facilities, likely controlled by local leaders. These leaders redistributed food, but also consolidated power. The monotony of farming thus supported hierarchies. Those who coordinated labor could rise in status. This system laid the groundwork for later empires, where rulers commanded entire valleys of terraces through organized labor. The monotony of farming became the machinery of power. Daily routines. For the ordinary farmer, life on the terraces was repetitive. At dawn, families carried tools to their plots, checking walls for cracks, clearing channels, planting or weeding. Children gathered fodder for llamas and alpacas, animals vital for transport and wool. Women prepared food, spun fibers, and tended smaller household plots. Meals were simple: potatoes, quinoa porridge, maize bread, beans. Variety came with the seasons. Life was measured not by dramatic events but by cycles of planting, harvest, and repair. The monotony of this routine can be felt even in the soil layers archaeologists uncover, season after season of planting, visible in the earth, each indistinguishable from the last. Terraces as identity. For Andean people, the terraces were more than fields. They were identity. Families tied their lineage to specific slopes, inheriting walls and fields across generations. To repair a terrace was to honor ancestors who had built it. To abandon one was to lose a piece of heritage. This connection fused land, labor, and memory. Terraces became sacred through use, their stones imbued with history. The dull repetition of farming was also an act of belonging, binding people to place. The unresolved question. As we look across valleys where terraces still cling to slopes, we must ask, did the farmers of the Andes see themselves as part of something enduring, or only as individuals surviving season by season? Did they imagine their labor supporting future empires, or only tomorrow's meal? Was their identity rooted in pride, or only in persistence? When the Inca rose to power in the 15th century, stretching their empire across thousands of miles of mountains, they inherited a landscape already shaped by centuries of terrace building. The Inca expanded and systematized what earlier farmers had created, but they did not invent it. The terraces that sustained Cusco and Machu Picchu were the legacy of forgotten generations who had already learned to coax life from stone and slope. This final section follows the terraces into the Inca world, through the disruptions of Spanish conquest, and into the present. It shows how monotonous labor across centuries became not only survival, but legacy. The Inca expansion. The Inca built on foundations laid long before them. They extended terrace systems on a monumental scale, integrating them into state projects. Entire valleys were terraced, with irrigation canals carrying glacial water across great distances. Under Inca rule, terrace farming was organized through the mita, a labor tax requiring communities to work on state projects. Families might spend weeks repairing walls, digging canals, or planting on fields that belonged to the empire rather than to themselves. The state redistributed harvests, storing maize and potatoes in vast granaries to feed armies, travelers, and urban populations. The monotony of farming thus became imperial policy. The endless task of placing stones and planting seeds was elevated to the machinery of empire. Terraces in daily Inca life. Even at the height of the Inca state, the daily rhythm of terrace life remained much as it had been for centuries. Farmers rose with the sun, carried tools to their fields, and tended crops step by step. Surplus supported temples and armies, but the work remained local, intimate, and repetitive. The difference was scale. A farmer might now be part of a system stretching from Ecuador to Chile, his harvest counted in state records, his surplus filling imperial storerooms. Yet for him, the labor still meant the same: planting potatoes, clearing channels, repairing walls. History's grandeur rested, as always, on monotony. The Spanish conquest. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century disrupted Andean life profoundly. Disease, warfare, and colonial systems broke the old patterns of terrace agriculture. Many terraces were abandoned as populations collapsed. Spanish encomiendas focused on extracting silver and gold rather than sustaining terrace systems. Without constant maintenance, walls crumbled, canals clogged, and soil eroded. Slopes once green with crops returned to scrub. The monotony of farming, interrupted by conquest, gave way to neglect. Yet not all terraces vanished. In remote valleys, communities continued to maintain their slopes, preserving traditions through adversity. These survivors carried forward the legacy of terrace agriculture even as empires fell. Rediscovery and modern use. Today, terraces still stripe Andean hillsides. Some are ancient and long abandoned, their walls crumbling, their soils eroded. Others remain in use, maintained by farmers who still grow potatoes, quinoa, and maize much as their ancestors did. Archaeologists study terraces not for grandeur but for endurance. Excavations reveal centuries of cultivation layered in soil, traces of irrigation systems still visible. Agronomists experiment with reviving abandoned terraces, finding them more resilient to erosion and climate stress than modern techniques. Tourists visiting Machu Picchu marvel at the terraces that cling to its slopes, but often see them only as picturesque backdrops. In truth, they are its foundation. Without terraces, Machu Picchu could never have been sustained. The legacy of boredom. The terraces remind us that history's greatest achievements are often boring. No single terrace is dramatic. Each wall, each channel, each repair is dull, repetitive, and unremarkable. But multiplied across valleys and centuries, they created the foundation for civilizations. The forgotten farmers of the Andes did not write their names in stone, but they left their labor in stone walls that still stand. Their boredom built empires. Reflection. As you imagine the terraces stretching into the clouds, think of the countless hands that placed stones, season after season, year after year. Think of the monotony of repair, the patience of planting, the rhythm of harvesting. Civilization here was not built in palaces or battles, but in persistence. And ask yourself, when future generations look back on us, will they remember our monuments or our maintenance? Will they see our skyscrapers or only our water systems, our roads, our quiet routines? Perhaps, like the terraces of the Andes, our true legacy will not be in spectacle but in boredom.